television news.
Well, to discuss what we've just seen right now, the confirmation of the Chief Justice of Nigeria is Mr. Onnoghen, who is a legal practitioner and also founder of Due Process
Advocates.
You're welcome to Sunrise Daily.
Thank you very much.
Expectations are high after so much, almost much ado about nothing, really. We've seen the confirmation of the Chief Justice of Nigeria. What are the expectations you have for the new Chief Justice?
I think the new Chief Justice is coming into his office confronted with a new set of problems. It hasn't been long that when we had this extraordinary first-time experience in Nigeria where the DSS raided the houses in the middle of the night, houses of several justices, and took them away. That brought up some questions that had never existed, even during military era. So, and it was happening at a time that you had more or less a vacancy at the Supreme Court, in the sense that the Justice Onnoghen had been in acting capacity for rather too long. So all these things raised concerns and fears, and I think that the confirmation of the Supreme Court Justice, the Chief Justice of Nigeria, is significant in terms of dousing these suspicions and concerns. So I think it's a major, major development in Nigeria today.
What expectations do you have for him? Because you just raised a very critical point. I think the senators there, it wasn't just the bow and go scenario. They grilled him quite a bit. He was there for over an hour receiving questions, or taking questions from the senators. They raised the question of independence of the judiciary. They raised the question of integrity as well. They don't want the judiciary to be pocketed by the executive arm of government, or any arm of government at that. And these are big questions being raised by Nigerians. How do you think he's going to fare in the light of all that has been raised in recent times?
Well, you understand that the court system or the judiciary is a fairly standardized institution. You have the appeal processes, the hierarchy of justices, and all these concerns are legitimate. What made them legitimate? More because of recent events, one of which I mentioned. And of course, you could see that during the confirmation process, they asked him about the question of enforcement of court orders, though he said that was the responsibility of the executive and the legislative arm of government, and correctly so. So this Chief Justice is coming into office with all these red flags out there. So his primary responsibility is going to be to douse these concerns. And I think that the Chief Justice is a fairly, very good jurist, and he has gone through the hierarchy. To go all the way to the Supreme Court of Nigeria requires a very prolonged process of rise on the hierarchy of the judiciary, from the High Court to Court of Appeals and ultimately to the Supreme Court, unlike in other countries.
The people who have criticized that, I mean, you heard the president's advisor, I think it was the Presidential Committee Against Corruption, saying that they have a problem with the fact that a judge, can calculate how long it would take him to get to the Supreme Court, that how long you'll spend at, say, the High Court and then perhaps the Court of Appeal, and it would seem that it's just a matter of time before you eventually get to the Supreme Court, and they think that there's a problem with that process. Do you agree with them?
Yes and no. To some extent, they are very correct, unlike other countries where you don't necessarily have to go all the way from the very bottom to the very top, because it creates a predictable track, and you see justices doing everything to conform just to make sure they get all the way to the Supreme Court. So that is correct to raise these questions. On the other hand, to become a Supreme Court justice, you need to have some experience in the way the court systems work, in the way the judicial process works, and you need to have some level of maturity. So I think you have merit on both sides. Perhaps we need to have some other people who could just come straight to the Supreme Court without having been in the judiciary for a long time. I think that is being considered, given the list of people I read that were being considered for further appointments into the Supreme Court, including the lawyers who had been in the academia or in law practice all their lives. So it is legitimate, but we have to be very concerned. If you get someone who has never been in the court system and you take him all the way to the Supreme Court, perhaps the experience he has had, either in the academia, in law practice, may not be sufficient. Really, it's going to be a hybrid. We cannot stick to the old traditional format where you have people from the scratch, from magistrate all the way to the Supreme Court, and without much experience elsewhere. So we can't have that, strictly. On the other hand, we can't just leave the court system and begin to appoint justices to the Supreme Court without some level of experience in the judiciary. It takes a lot of discipline, really, to become a judge and to go through the hog and to come to the point where your pronouncements of the law actually gives meaning and content to the law, which is what the Supreme Court is. And that's why it is unique. Supreme Court is unique because the laws really have no meaning until they have been pronounced upon by the Supreme Court. And in many countries, I can tell you that when lawyers discuss the law, they always point out that the Supreme Court of Nigeria has not pronounced on it, or that the Supreme Court of their country has not pronounced on it, because ultimately, until the Supreme Court pronounces on the law, all we have are a mere assumption of what the law is.
Interesting. But then, let's talk about the expectations again. First of all, I think in that regard, would you say that the Supreme Court has been proactive, or the NJC, beg your pardon, has been proactive with the new list that they've brought up for people who can be Supreme Court justices? Are they being proactive in that area?
I think so, because I saw on the list several lawyers who had never been in the judiciary, who had never been judges in their lives. I don't want to mention names, because if I do, if I mention some names and not all the names, it will seem as if I'm campaigning for some people. But I saw the names of lawyers. Some have been in the academia, and some have been in law practice exclusively all their lives. All their professional career.
So you think that's a good thing, right?
I think it is a good thing, but remember, we're going to have some hybrid. Appointing 1 or 2 justices of the Supreme Court from outside the bench will not be sufficient to completely overturn what we have today. It's going to interject or bring into the fold of justices people with a different perspective.
Do we need to overturn it? What we have today is not good enough?
Well, I don't think we need to overturn it, but I don't think we have to leave it as it is. I believe in constant modification, learning, improvement, reforms. So new ideas should come in, maybe not on a wholesale basis, but some sign that we are not sticking to some orthodox position is important. So honestly, what is going on, it seems good, because I know that maybe 1 or 2 such lawyers could make it to the Supreme Court. I don't think that 1 or 2 lawyers radically changes what we have. Do we need to radically change what we have? Perhaps yes, but you got to be careful about what change you embark upon. It's often nice to speak about change, but ultimately we end up with an outcome that nobody anticipated. So that's why, to some extent, on this, I will sound like a gradualist. I want some level of modification, perhaps not too radically, especially when we cannot predict the outcome.
But you don't think the risk will be worth it?
No, I think that the risk of error at this point could be disastrous, given the errors that have been made in other places, really. If you get into the Supreme Court the wrong people, I'm sorry. That would be the end of it. Because you have a National Assembly that is inherently weak. You have a presidency or the